brick was Nat Turner. Also an intelligent and talented man. Why do they all have to be intelligent and talented? Why is that? Turner had escaped from slavery but had voluntarily returned because of religious convictions. He became a mystic and frequently buried himself in prayer. He sometimes experienced visions. Through these visions, he felt that he had been divinely ordained to lead his people out of bondage. Because of his mysticism, little time and effort went into planning the revolt. Therefore, it involved fewer participants than previous revolts, but it became the biggest slave uprising in North America. Armed with an axe and clubs, 6 men first murdered the plantation owner and his family, and then proceeded to nearby houses, killing all through the night. Altogether, they murdered 55 whites. By the time the rebellion had been quelled, Turner's troop numbered more than 60. The Army of the United States was finally called to put down the rebellion, and they were joined by other whites who attacked the slaves indiscriminately. They massacred them. The attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown, a white man, was an important uprising and no doubt played a major role in the abolition of slavery. However, few slaves joined Brown in his attempt to liberate the slaves. Brown devoted his entire life to the elimination of slavery, and once he became convinced that moral appeals were of no avail to slaveholders, he concentrated on armed revolt. As with Nat Turner, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was subdued by armed militia. You notice how, even in this book, they did not refer to John Brown as intelligent or vastly talented. That's right, yeah, it implies other slaves were not intelligent, as you stated. Yeah, that's the thing. They think these people were dumb. The reality is they were in fear. Think about it. 1619. Now this is 1800. This is practically 200 years later. In 200 years, how many generations is that? How many generations were sold away? Remember, slaves were not allowed to do anything legal. So all their marriages were not marriages legally. They would just have sex so I could get another slave. They forced the women to be basically have sex with whoever, or even the slave owners would have sex with them to produce more children. It's a strategy to just to keep control. Yeah. Although there were many revolts by the slaves in North America, few of them gained a significant amount of momentum, and all of them failed. In no case did they succeed in improving the status of the slaves. Rather, they generally brought forth repressive measures. Some reasons for the failure of the slave revolts may be advanced. The very nature of slavery and its effects on the slave were such that successful insurrections was impossible. They tried to free themselves, they tried to free others, and they were broken down, beaten down, at the end of the day made it worse for everybody else. Ain't that crazy? Don't we see that happening now? I know I listen to a lot of comedy. I listen to a lot of Dave Chappelle specifically, but I love his style of comedy. And he did have this joke about the Me Too movement in the context that using fear is not going to solve the problem, right? And he predicted it was going to get worse. After he did that one special, when he said that, that's when all the anti-abortion laws were coming out, making it harder for women to use their choice and their rights. To a degree, it got worse. Fear and attacks, I have never seen them as sustainable solutions. And yet we have these insurrections are happening. They're being used to just beat down the slaves even further. Emotionally, like I'm drained, but I'm going to try and finish these last couple paragraphs and end this video in a bit. But it's hard looking at history. It's even harder looking at it objectively. And it sucks when you start putting the pieces together when you analyze what's happening today. As Elkins has written, American slavery operated as a closed system, one in which, for generality of slaves in their nature, as men and women, subspecie, contacts where free society could occur only on the most narrowly circumscribed of terms. Such a system had a demoralizing effect on the slaves' personalities, thereby rendering widespread participation in revolts unlikely and, in many cases, unthinkable. As has been mentioned, slaveholders encouraged status differences among slaves as a means of dividing and conquering them. House slaves versus field slaves. When revolts were being planned, they were most often betrayed by the category of slaves most closely allied to the owner, the house slaves. Because the plantation was a closed system, communication among slaves on the various plantations was impossible. Whenever slaves met for whatever reason, they were under the constant surveillance of whites. Finally, of crucial importance was the ratio of slaves to whites in North America. Slaves were usually outnumbered, and where they happened to be in the majority, any slaveholder had the full force of the military at its disposal for the purpose of maintaining order among them. This was the situation after the colonies gained independence, and it was during this period that organized slave revolts were common. Therefore, the lack of success of slave revolts cannot be taken as an indication of their acceptance of their status. As Stamp has written, in truth, no slave uprising has had a chance of ultimate success, even though it might have cost the master heavy casualties. The great majority of the disarmed and outnumbered slaves, knowing the futility of rebellion, refused to join in any of the numerous plots. Most slaves had to express their desire for freedom in less dramatic ways. Near the end of this video, I'm going to finish off these last couple paragraphs so I can finish this one topic. Recognizing the futility of organized rebellion, most slaves expressed their antipathy for slavery in individual acts. Most frequently, these acts took the form of escape from slavery. From the very inception of the institution until its end, runaway slaves posed problems for the slaveholders. The newspapers of the period were full of advertisements in search of slaves who had escaped. The exact number of slaves to escape is not known, but is estimated that thousands fled each year. Estimates of the total number of escapees in the 4 decades between 1810 and 1850 run as high as 100,000, with a value of more than $30 million. So great was the number of runaway slaves that in 1793, Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Law, which empowered a slaveholder to seize runaway slaves who had crossed state lines and ultimately return them to the state from which they fled. The persistence of slaves in risking their lives to escape serves as dramatic evidence of their reaction to their status. One thing that's unique about the United States is laws don't disappear. They get repealed, they get changed internally, but they're never unwritten. The Fugitive Slave Law that was enacted by Congress is still a law that's in the books. It is crossed out because another law eventually repealed it, but it doesn't go away. Hence why we have an 18th Amendment that is crossed out and repealed, but the writing of it is still in the document itself. A significant portion of the slaves to escape were aided in their endeavors by free blacks and white abolitionists. The Underground Railroad is said to have been incorporated in 1804. It was an organized effort to assist slaves attempting to escape. It was operated in defiance of federal fugitive slave laws, and thousands of slaves were able to escape to the north and to Canada through its utilization. So well organized was it that funds for this operation were solicited from philanthropists, employing several thousand workers. The Underground Railroad operated hundreds of stations in the east and west. The number of slaves to escape through the Underground Railroad is not known, but estimates run into the hundreds of thousands, with an estimated 40,000 passing through Ohio alone. There are recorded instances in which individual conductors on the Underground Railroad assisted thousands of black people in their escape from slavery. Although some slaves successfully accommodated to their status, the persistence of runaway slaves posed continuous problems for the slaveholders. So widespread was this phenomenon that a Southern doctor was convinced that Negroes suffered from a disease of the mind. A disease of the mind which he called drapetomania. Drapetomania. Weird word. Which caused them to run away. In reality, however, aside from the general harshness and degradation inherent in the institution of slavery, several of its special features served to motivate slaves to flee. Arbitrary separation of slaves from their families induced many of them to escape. Other slaves resented being moved against their will. Still others reacted to such factors as attempts to work them too severely, fear of punishment, and fear of being sold into the deep South. The major motivation, however, was a desire to escape from the inhumanity which the institution of slavery imposed on them. The constant fleeing of slaves is hardly compatible with the view of them held by a leading historian of slavery during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Ulrich B. Phillips saw that slaves as possessing a readiness for loyalty of a feudal sort, that he viewed them as a people who were eager to please the slaveholder by working sturdily to a hard boss. He saw them as a people who, for the most part, were the racial quality submissive rather than defiant. The views expressed by Phillips were widely shared among slaveholders and writers of the period. They used slavery to make people feel inferior. Never forget where we came from, and never forget to learn and listen to others. Welcome